What we're doing is we're doing a lot more workrooms at CAP, and so this week we're going to feature a presentation by David Winterton. I'm just going to bring up his poster here. David Winterton is an architect. He works out of Toronto, and he works with ERA. He previously worked in the United States with Robert Stern, and we're fortunate to have him here. And he's going to be speaking about Frank Darling. My name is Andrew Waldron. I think, as I see the names here, I think I know most of you. I am speaking to you from the territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin in Ottawa, where it's a little dark and ashen because we're having forest fires north of here, so it's a little smoky around here. What I'd like to do is, this is the format. I'm going to give it over to David to give the presentation, and then we will be open for questions afterwards. And many of these workrooms have lively discussions and questions. To do this, I'd like to have as many who are comfortable having their camera on, have it on, because I really appreciate it with presenting to faces rather than just names and blank screen. So we've got Sean who started here. That's wonderful. We've got some fabulous people here. Oh, fantastic. And if you are eating your lunch and you need to, munch away on your sandwich, then you can always turn your camera on. But it's always pleasant to have faces to present to. David has just come back hot off the press from the SSAC conference, the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. He was presenting at the SSAC. So this is part of it, but he's refined it a little bit for our benefit. We are going to record this. It will be posted later, and I think we'll respect your time. Make sure it's under the hour. Okay. So David, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think you have the ability to share your presentation. Give us a moment, people. Just wait. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm just going to share my screen. If you can give me a thumbs up if it's full screen or
no,
not yet. How's that?
No, it's not full screen.
Is it yet?
No. Unfortunately, we had tested this beforehand. It worked perfectly fine.
Okay,
of course.
I can stop share.
Yeah.
Bear with us. I'm going to share again.
We're trying to be smooth. Now we've got perfect full screen here.
Great.
So I'll take it away. I'll be on mute. If you do have questions and you're a little shy at asking them, you can always post them in the comments or in the chat area. I can always relay them back to David. If you have to go early and you have a question, you can always post it. We can always talk about it then. So again, we'll mute everyone while David gives the presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay, take it away, David.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks for everyone who's attending. Today, as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to talk about the Frank Darling Book Project, and this is a reprise of the SSAC talk that I gave last week in Calgary, but I've added a few treats at the end, some recent archival finds that are quite exciting. So in September, my firm ERA and I announced the Frank Darling Book Project on the SSAC blog and on ERA's website. The project is to prepare a long-awaited monograph on Darling and Pearson, the preeminent Edwardian architecture firm in Canada. I am leading the project organizationally, and Sean Blank, an ERA employee, is assisting as the research lead. And today I'm going to describe the progress of the project, our methodologies, and also share some of the research that focuses on Darling and Pearson's extensive Western Canadian bank architecture. But first, some theoretical background. The research and writing for the monograph have given me the opportunity to approach the material and review the historiography in a rigorous way. Kelly Crossman's Architecture in Transitions was a fundamental scholarly starting point for me. I read it a long time ago and I refer to it often. In it, a major theme is developed about the tension between the strong British architectural legacy in English Canada and the slow but sure infiltration of American Beaux-Arts ideas. Darling and Pearson inhabited the Britannic pole of this tension, mostly. And this is, I'm talking about the late 19th century, of course. Interestingly, Kelly's cover image is the front facade drawing of the 1912 Bank of British North America on storied St. James Street, Rue Saint-Jacques in Montreal, the original Canadian Bankers Row. It was a building designed by Barrett, Blackadder, and Webster, and has since been demolished and almost completely stricken from the record. But that bank building was part of an impressive streetscape which contained a suite of gorgeous and grand banks on St. James, an architectural indulgence that would be replicated across Canada's other financial centers, especially Edwardian Toronto and Winnipeg, as we shall see. There was truly an abundance of bank architecture in this period, much of it designed by the Toronto-based Darling and Pearson architects. And in the book, I argue that the quality and ubiquity of Canadian Edwardian bank architecture is a unique phenomenon. It was achievable because of the intersection of three conditions. The first is the late 19th century perfection of the Canadian banking system, which allowed a few chartered banks to have an unlimited number of branches in markets they wanted to saturate. The plethora of resulting classical branch buildings is an identifiable and significant modern Canadian building type, in my estimation. Number two, an aggressive early 20th century federal immigration policy to, quote, settle the West along rail lines and generally increase population of the country. So more people equals more depositing customers and more need for banking services like loans. And number three, an imperialist zeitgeist, which encouraged the idea of, quote, Greater Britain, or fostering this idea of Greater Britain and the privileging of British architectural history and ideas. So this influence of imperialism writ large on early 20th century architectural ideation in Canada has been a very important research vector for the project. The period's pro-imperial sentiment was so prevalent culturally and politically, and so glaringly obvious in primary sources in turn of the century articles, political debates, and economic endeavors, that it is at the very least curious that its influence on architecture hasn't been more overtly contextualized until recently. To shed light on this much needed, to shed much needed light on this subject and paralleling my research, Alex Bremner has recently published Building Greater Britain, which takes up these themes as they intersect with architectural history. He studies in depth the idea of Edwardian Baroque architecture as an imperial expression. The book is filled with great examples of this architecture from the Dominion hoods of Ireland, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and of course, Britain, but there's only a couple examples from Canada. He ever so politely mentioned to me the lack of architectural historiography on this period. One of the Canadian examples that did make it into this important book, however, is Darling and Pearson's design for the Federal Post Office in Winnipeg, shown here center. And by the way, on the extreme right with the dome is Darling and Pearson's Bank of Nova Scotia. The fact that Bremner selected a Canadian example of the Edwardian Baroque in Winnipeg is significant. The Boom City was an incubator for the development of Canadian Edwardian architecture and would become a foundationally important site for architectural experimentation for Darling and Pearson. But what about Frank Darling and his ultimate partnership with John A. Pearson? That's Frank Darling on the left and John Pearson on the right. That nothing has been formally published on this firm is quite remarkable given the breadth of their scope. We have now counted at least 375 projects from coast to coast in every province, far outdoing even their closest competitors. Unfortunately, there are few written records about Darling, his office staff, or his negotiations with clients. The firm suffered 3 catastrophic fires over the course of its life, the last in the 1940s, where all the records and drawings and sketchbooks, et cetera, were incinerated. The narratives, therefore, of the genesis of their buildings is therefore currently a little weak. So the architectural historian, that's us, is left mostly to analyze the work itself. And we are relying on a constellation of institutional and corporate archives to unearth architectural and biographical information. And all the bank and city and provincial archives have been very enthusiastically supporting this project. So to set ourselves up to analyze these projects, we are, of course, using Robert Hill's excellent biographical dictionary of architects in Canada as our online base resource. Sean Blank and myself are enhancing that base with independent research, but essentially took the BDAC info, input it into an Excel worksheet, and created a database. We've expanded informational fields, provided codes for each building type. You can see here the codes on the left, the building type in the middle with color coded. Wherever there's a green splotch, it means we've got visual imagery for it, a column for date, etc. It's a great research tool. Then taking visual inspiration from this 1912 Toronto promotional book with its collage of 6 Bank of Commerce branches, all designed by Darling and Pearson, we prepared posters or contact sheets of all the projects so that we can group and compare types, especially between the banks, but we have contact sheets for the residential projects, the institutional projects, et cetera, covering all the building types. So starting with, for instance, an assemblage of the temple-fronted masonry banks across southern Ontario and Manitoba, then following the expansion through the prairies and onto the prefabricated banks, which I'll get into in a moment. It's frankly remarkable and even an exuberant collection of architectural ideas. Even within each type, each one is slightly different, each one like a classical haiku to the Canadian banking system. I'll now shift focus to Darling and Pearson's work west of Lake Superior, understanding that there was also significant output in southern Ontario and the Maritimes and parts of Quebec at this time as well. Earlier, I mentioned Bankers Row on Rue St. James in Montreal. There was an analog on Toronto's King Street, but a particularly spectacular Bankers Row on Main Street in Winnipeg. By the turn of the 19th century, the Canadian banking system was essentially perfected, as I mentioned. It was arguably a function of the greater imperial project. It permitted profits and money from savings in established and stable communities, say in southern Ontario, as well as massive capital investments from the UK to go to emerging and loan-hungry places such as turn-of-the-century prairies. The banking system cemented imperial networks. And critical to our story, in 1903, the Canadian Bank of Commerce created a bond-issuing real estate development company whose job it was to purchase prime properties and finance the construction of a multitude of branches that would then be rented back to the bank at reasonable and predictable rates. Excuse me. So for the Canadian Bank of Commerce, this entity was known as the Dominion Realty Company, and they didn't dawdle. After 1903, things got a little crazy in terms of branch construction. The Toronto or Montreal-based banks needed a regional headquarters to oversee operations for the expanding West, and as we know, Winnipeg was where this happened. Several of the banks, at least 5, had Darling and Pearson prepare designs for them. Excuse me. The first off the mark were the Sandstone Dominion Bank of 1899, with its grand banking hall and its dandy bankers. I should mention here that the banks have found boxes of staff photography, and in many cases, it's the only opportunity we have to see the interiors of these great banking halls, as well as these great Edwardian suites. In the same year, directly across the street, across Main Street, they designed the Winnipeg headquarters for the Winnipeg regional office for the Bank of Commerce, also in 1899. This design is Darling Pearson's very first identifiably classical Baroque effort, but is it Edwardian Baroque? To my eyes, it still has some elements of Victorian classicism, but there is a temperance to the scale of classical elements here, which were often the subject of architectural reinterpretation, infusing whimsy and overblown scale in the examples of very mannerist Edwardian architecture. Regardless, after After the Winnipeg experiment, the next temple-fronted study was in Hamilton, Ontario, for the Traders Bank. And then 1 year later, the very exuberant, height of Edwardian Baroque, Bank of Nova Scotia in Toronto in 1902. With the Bank of Nova Scotia confection, Darling and Pearson seemed to have crossed a line of mannerist decorum that they would not reach again. Still, some tropes and family resemblances would remain consistent, like a layered facade, exaggerated voussoirs and coins, a triumphant sculptural program, and an architectural focus on dramatic and rich interiors, all emblematic of Edwardian architecture. But back to Winnipeg. It was quickly becoming the tall building capital of Canada, and here we see our Bank of Commerce on the left, and in center stage is the 7-story Merchant Bank building. It's a Montreal-based bank that was designed by Andrew Thomas Taylor's firm. Not quite a definable skyscraper. The historians have suggest that an early skyscraper is defined as being 10 stories and over and contains an elevator. So it is with the design of the country's first definable skyscraper at 10 stories in Winnipeg that Darling and Pearson would learn the ropes on tall building design and construction for the Union Bank. It is a classic early skyscraper with a base, a tall banking hall, undifferentiated middle, and an elaborate cornice. It was only a couple of years later, well, let me show you the picture of the elaborate cornice. There it is, buff brick and stone at the base, lots of terracotta for the coins and the voussoirs, and a metal cornice up at the top with oil buff windows. It was only a couple years later that Darling and Pearson would design a building of similar height in Winnipeg, the 10-story Grain Exchange building. The sheer size of this building really underscores the importance of the grain trade to the west. And here's an image that our friends at the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation found of the interior trading floor, which has since been subdivided into 2 floors. At this point, the banking lords had found their architectural firm and settled on their architectural identities, and it was time for the Bank of Commerce to really expand in the west. In the more established communities, and remember, the main CPR line was completed in 1885, so the urban hierarchy across the prairies had become pretty clear at this point. Darling and Pearson studies in Edwardian masonry bank architecture predominated, and they had an impressive range of types. So here's one in Brandon, Manitoba. You can see the exaggerated coins and the cartouche and the kind of modeled facade. It had an analog the same year in London, Ontario, which was the same model, but slightly bigger. A completely different type in Medicine Hat, still classical with a pediment, flat pilasters, and then in Saskatoon, a model that was also repeated in Southern Ontario, again, with the flat pilasters and the pediment. But in many other areas where growth was unexpectedly rapid or where the success of the community was not ensured, but still had urgent banking needs, the Commerce had the firm design structures using a prefabricated and airtight wood panel system under the auspices of the BC Mills Timber and Trading Company. These could be delivered in a railway boxcar and erected in a couple days. So this is one in Carman, Manitoba. Unfortunately, this image, the drawing has now been destroyed. So the only image we have of this showing the actual construction details is on microfiche. We're going to try and sharpen that one up. Here's a few other examples. So the Carman, Manitoba rendering. Watson, Saskatchewan. So some of these prefabs are very well loved. This one has been converted into a museum. There's an associated historic plaque with it. Others reside in ghost towns and are not faring so well. This one in Drinkwater, Saskatchewan. There were 3 main types of prefabs that Darling and Pearson designed. And by today's count, we have identified about 40 erected west of Superior. So type 1 is what I'm calling the classical portico. It's flat pilasters with a pediment. Number 2 was a hipped roof with a porch version. This one is a photograph of the Canadian Bank of Commerce prefab bank in San Francisco, California. The company shipped the prefab down immediately after the earthquake in 1905, so they could maintain banking needs during that period of the disaster and going forward. And this is also Darling Pearson's only known work in the United States. And then number 3 was what we're calling this split classical portico. So it has a fascia going around midpoint of the building. We also uncovered 2 Alberta types that are Darling Pearson designs, one in Innisfail and one is Claresholm. Both of them have been demolished, but this is a kind of a subtype of the classical portico with these projecting windows up at the top. We thought it would be interesting to visualize the intensity of the westward expansion of the banking system. So we prepared GIS mapping of the chronology of Bank of Commerce construction across the West, following as settlement did the rail lines and the creation of the Dominion Realty Company. So we have our main branch in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and a main branch in Vancouver and one in Regina. And so up until 1903, you see the green dots. It was masonry banks constructed in the province of Manitoba. Of course, Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't join Confederation until 1905. And there were no prefabs constructed in this period. But then after 1903, the masonry branches really proliferated across the 2 new provinces and the interior of British Columbia, as well as continuing to proliferate in Manitoba. So we've counted 40 masonry bank branches between 1903 and 1910. And for the prefabs, 35 branches in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. So those are the gold dots. That's a lot of banking nodes in the network that needed oversight, accounting, and other financial reportage. All those reports were sent to Winnipeg first, the regional HQ, processed, then on to head office. The volume of information necessitated more space for the bank bureaucracy and a new expression of the consolidated power of the Bank of Commerce. In 1911, their original regional branch in Winnipeg, which we've seen before, was dismantled and rebuilt in Regina, and then eventually moved into a mall, sadly, and replaced with a much more austere expression in the old location. So here's that photograph again of the Merchant Bank and the Canadian Bank of Commerce. So this Commerce Bank was dismantled and replaced with this more austere classical portico between these 2 skinny buildings, which frame it. It contains one, if not the finest banking hall in the country. Typical of their approach to bank planning, the customer would enter through the compressed space flanked on either side by offices. So at ERA, we have students that are preparing drawings and sections of the banks, and this is one of them. So we generated this section so the customer would come through this compressed space and then enter into the grand banking hall. Originally naturally lit, you can see this magnificent dome. It's since been covered over due to Canadian climatic situation. Multiple floors of office space bracketed this space around the skylight in a U. The very important work of the regional superintendent occupied the 2nd floor Jacobean Hall, and the fireplace was salvaged from the original bank and reinstalled here. So Darling Pearson undoubtedly used their Montreal main branch of 1908, which preceded the Winnipeg branch, as a precedent for the Winnipeg main branch. And in my estimation, the both are tied in their grandeur of their banking halls. Rue Saint-Jacques is a very skinny street, so I'm mystified about how they got this front-on photograph, but this gives you a sense of the similarities with Winnipeg, although rather than entering through the rusticated base, you walk past these Corinthian columns. And similar to Winnipeg, there is an entry sequence of going through a compressed space of the portico, the manager's office, and then into this magnificent banking hall. CIBC shared some detailed construction photos with us of the project, which are really wonderful to see. Some of them had what appeared to be laborers installing a massive granite cornice, but on closer inspection ended up being one of those rare and thrilling finds. So when we were filing these images quickly, we go back to them and look at them more carefully. But when we first got them, we thought, okay, here's some construction fellows doing their thing. And we zoomed in, realized they were a little bit too nicely dressed to be laborers. And this is the only photograph we have of Frank Darling on a job site. So that's him in the bowler hat. On our right is Jules Wegmann, his Swiss clerk who was looking after this building in Montreal. I can't quite describe the expression on his face, but we were pretty thrilled to get this and let the CIBC archives know that we'd identified Frank Darling. I think we've got one more. And then, Andrew, it was kind of fortuitous that you chose this image as the poster for my talk, because at this point we hadn't really figured this out, but that's Frank Darling peeking out from under the acanthus leaf in the Capitol. So it's a pretty thrilling find, considering that there's a real paucity of information on Frank Darling himself and photographs of him. So permit me to philosophize a little bit about bank architecture in Canada. And I trust the proceeding gives a general idea of the incredible output and range of bank designs that Darling and Pearson produced. The bank architecture occupies a critical and rich place in Canadian architectural history. To conceptualize it, I've wondered about repurposing Northrop Frye's undoubtedly out of fashion and problematic lit crit idea of the garrison mentality, this 1960s theory he used to conceive the Canadian literary imagination. According to this concept, the non-Indigenous Canadian imagination, quote, domesticated the psychological wilderness by the imposition of systems, abstract and concrete, of institutional order on the landscape. And this psychological mode undergirded literary output. So if Northrop Frye was an architectural historian, he may have mapped the banking system onto this concept too, as another later layer of this social imaginary. In other words, architectural materialization of the financial network becomes another agent of this psycho-architectural ordering of, in this case, prairie space. And because of its highly coded Edwardian architecture reflects the strong imperial connections that tethered that space to the rest of the British world. I mentioned previously that Edwardian bank architecture, bank branch architecture, is a Canadian building type that underlines the importance of transactional spaces. That a family's savings deposited in a temple-fronted stone and brick bank in Strathroy, Ontario, could be loaned for a new commercial building project in Regina, Saskatchewan, via a transaction in a similarly pedimented stone bank there, or for a more remote immigrant farmer's startup loan via a wooden prefab temple bank. This connected disparate parts of the Dominion. These transactions collapsed geographical distance and topographical burdens into the value of a banknote or a telegram wire transfer, which is surely an unspoken objective of the Canadian Imperial Project. Thank you.
That was just wonderful to hear. Oh, David, you had some.
Well, I just wanted to give credit to one of our students did a capriccio of all the Darling and Pearson buildings set within their Dominion Bank Hall. And I love sharing this image because it's so much fun.
Well, it was maybe fantastic, but also a little overwhelming in the scope. I mean, you've compressed this into a 20-minute presentation, but I mean, there's so many questions that come out of this in terms of imperialism, in terms of colonialism, in terms of systems in Canada. Many of these systems, including the identity of banking in Canada and its direct relationship to each of us and as establishing it. I have a personal connection. Full disclosure is that my grandfather was a bank manager at the Winnipeg Imperial Bank of Commerce in downtown, and he started out at the Bank of Commerce in Guelph, which has been demolished, replaced. But it ties into many of us, the sort of settler culture side of things. I mean, I have all sorts of questions, all the questions about Edwardian architecture, Beaux-Arts elements, your theatricality and the way you're looking at these spaces. I was asking myself about, has there been any other studies? I know we had done a banking study at Parks Canada years ago, informally about doing inventories of banks, but has anyone done any work on the Bank of Montreal's or the McKim and White ones, the John Lyle work with Bank of Nova Scotia that was also, I don't know if it went out west. I mean, there's a lot of questions here. Maybe what I'd like to do, maybe, you know, rather than you give me just a conversational answer, I want to open it up to people that have been watching. Is anyone wanting to ask a question? You just have to raise your virtual hand and you can ask a question. And don't be shy. There's lots of.
Well, Andrew, I can say that I still believe that bank architecture in Canada is an understudied topic. There was a publication and an exhibition at the CCA years ago called Money Matters, and that was pan North American. So it was a nice survey, but to really kind of zoom in and focus on, and of course, I'm focusing on Darling Pearson, who were the preeminent bank architects, but there were lots of Western architects and Montreal-based architects who were doing plenty of banks as well.
Well, and there were so many banks. There were so many of them prior to the 1929 crash and
Right.
the creation of the Bank of Canada. So there's that. I think James has a question. He's got his hand up.
Hi, Dave. Great presentation. Found it very interesting. Doing parallel research with John Pearson.
Right. Hi. Nice to see your face. We've emailed before.
Yeah, I think we'll have to exchange a bit more after this, sharing information. I think we've identified a few, with John Ward, we've identified a few more prefab banks to add to the inventory.
Wonderful.
As part of your breakdown analysis, are you sort of looking at sort of timeframes and change in style of the buildings over time? Yeah, you did allude to it, but are you getting down to the granularity of seeing certain features repeated or used in different ways, and track that as part of the evolution of the partnership?
Yes, and that's one of the purposes of us doing the contact sheets, and we've got some that are chronological, so we can see the slight changes in the design moves over time. And the other thing that I've come to realize is when I first started, I was thinking, they were the Edwardian architecture firm in Canada, and their architecture is exclusively Edwardian, but they did absorb scores and scores of staff who had been working all over the world. And I think working as an architect in Toronto, you couldn't escape American architectural ideas and Beaux-Arts influence. So I feel like Darling and Pearson may have kind of started off on a very kind of Edwardian push, and then tempered it somewhat over time. So there's a little bit more, it's not quite as exuberant as some of the Edwardian architecture you'd see in the UK or South Africa or Australia, because they weren't as influenced by American architecture. And so that's something we're trying to trace and uncover in the book.
Right. Yeah. Looking at some of the different buildings you've done, in my sort of scan, I do start seeing like, there might be some very personal touches. And I think that came in some of the photographs you showed, for example, of the mantelpiece of the fireplace and certain aspects of the front facade design composition. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. Thank you.
It's funny you mentioned the fireplaces, because I very strongly believe that the fireplace was where Frank Darling kind of put his imagination of the DNA of each project into the fireplace design. So the fireplace design at the Bank of Montreal, in Toronto, in the Toronto Club, in Holwood, Joseph Lavelle's house, they're magnificent fireplaces, and a lot of architectural ideas and thought went into them. So I do want to get in and photograph all the fireplaces as an appendix.
Oh, we look forward to seeing those.
Yeah.
I think someone else has their hand up now. Thanks for your feedback.
Jeannie, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, David. Great presentation. I'm the person for Medicine Hat, so the CIBC one there, very familiar with, and I grew up there, but I went back and worked. So I've worked with the heritage there, so I'm glad it's one that we inventoried and is on the inventory. But I'm in Calgary now, but I was gonna say, have you identified how many of his buildings remain still, or how many have been lost out of your totality of I mean, there's lots there. I'm always curious as to how many of them have been saved of an architect, because I know that despite some of their grandeur, and some of them are more modest, that some are getting lost. And I saw that picture of the Saskatchewan one, which is obviously falling apart, not being, protected.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I was just curious as to
Because we have this database, we can calculate all kinds of statistics, and it's been really fun. That's the one I don't have in my head right now, but I think it's around half remain.
okay.
And as you probably know, especially in the small towns like Woodstock or Chatham or places like that in Southern Ontario, in the 60s and 70s, the CIBC took down the Edwardian banks and put up more modern looking banks.
Yeah.
But the much smaller hamlets seem to have saved their banks. So it's and then there's lots of the small branches that still exist in Toronto.
Yeah.
But I would say it's about half.
Okay. Yeah, that's still a big number. I'm still surprised that many would have been lost, right? Kind of and then and I get what you're saying. Like, I mean, in Medicine Hat, we had saved, quite a few of them, but ones like the Bank of Montreal, which was a beautiful bank, at the corner, and that it too got knocked down, just a modest single story. So some of the grandeur ones still, even at a smaller scale, have been lost. So I'm surprised to hear that 50% have, but then again, not surprised. So
yeah, I'll check on that number, but it's a sad number. And then a lot of the banks aren't banks anymore, so they've been repurposed as bars or what have you. And so I kind of joke with the CIBC archivist that when this book is published, the CIBC brass are going to wish they hadn't sold off all those branches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great, Jeannie. Thanks. Sean, you have your hand raised. Oh, you're on.
I was just in response to Jeannie, I'm in the office right now. So I quickly consulted our Excel, and this isn't a great number, but of the 373 that we've identified, I've using the spreadsheet, 125 we've identified as demolished. So that's not necessarily an indicator of some we aren't quite sure of the status. But
so that's much better, right?
Better.
Yeah. 2/3 remain.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah. By the way, I'd like to introduce Sean Blank, who's the research lead for the Frank Darling project, doing an amazing job.
Thank you.
He's reaching out to hundreds of archives across the country.
Yeah.
I guess that leads to a question about rehabilitation of these, and so many of the banks are closing their branches. There's been waves of those, and so you mentioned how some have been converted into bars and so on, or meeting spaces and so on. But we know that there are the Bank of Montreal in Winnipeg, for instance, I think it's going to be an Indigenous center, I believe. Or
I think that's right.
Yeah. Are there many of these banks that have you got that data in terms of rehabilitation? Have you got some details on repurposing these spaces?
That would be a super interesting data point, but we don't have that yet.
Right.
Our ERA worked on a project for mod developments where one of the Bank of Commerce's on Yonge Street was reincorporated as the condo amenity space and entrance into the condo itself, and the tower is set back quite a bit from it, and they restored some of the interior spaces. So I think that would be an interesting kind of part of the conclusion of the book, to say, here's all these grand structures that have beautiful interiors that could be rehabilitated for things perhaps other than bars. And the magnificent restoration of the Bank of Montreal at Yonge and Front Street in Toronto which really put Darling and Pearson on the map in 1885, is now the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Yes, and the did they do the one on Spark Street in Ottawa?
Yes.
Yeah, which is a dismantleable interior that can be returned from the Library of Parliament into the structure itself. So it's really a framework within the building, which is interesting. I think Sean's got his hand up.
Sorry, again, just on that point, I think what's also interesting is that a lot of the banks, even if they have been demolished, the Darling branches, it's been easy to, in some cases, to identify the original locations because they were replaced with modernist branches after the demolition, and still used as bank branches for the original bank, or the bank that commissioned the branch. So in some cases, the use has remained since construction, and that's true of some of the original branches too.
I just noticed that Spencer Higgins is on the call, so full credit to Spencer for the amazing restoration of Darling Pearson's important work of the Bank of Montreal in Toronto.
That's wonderful. That's right. There he is. Yeah, are there any other questions? Do people? I would be curious to know a little bit. You touched on Kelly's book, which is a fabulous work. You touched on Darling as an architect, but you didn't give a lot about Darling, where he's positioned within the architectural culture of Canada in the late 19th, early 20th century. I mean, there's a difference in age between Pearson, I think, and Darling, isn't there?
Right.
And where does Darling emerge from he's studied in London, right? He's in the UK.
Yeah, so his life story is really interesting. His father was an Anglican clergyman who was really believed in high church ideals. So at a young age, Frank Darling was seeing his father, add decoration and costumery and extra architectural details into church. I think it was Little Trinity was his first effort. So, and was very established in the Anglican community in Toronto. So he got him, he must have been kind of a precocious talent, got him an apprenticeship with Langley when he was 16. And because of the Anglican connections, got him his next apprenticeship was with George Edmund Street in London while the very contentious law courts project was happening. So he must have been doing revision after revision of the law courts, which saw so many different iterations. And then my theory is he got a little freaked out or tired and went on to a gentler place, which was with Arthur Blomfield, to do some high church renovations across Southern England. And then came back and worked for, Bishop Strawn, and his father did a few Anglican commissions. Eventually got partnered up with George Curry. They did some very fine work in the 1880s in the Romanesque Revival style, but also the outlier of the Bank of Montreal. And then things kind of plodded along okay for a while, but he had met in boys' school at Trinity College in Toronto. He was connected with some other elite families. So those gentlemen were kind of rising in their position in the Toronto elite at the same time. So basically, Edmund Walker, who perfected the Canadian banking system, was exactly the same age as Frank Darling. I had a theory that they asked Frank to do their banks and their office buildings first, and then asked him to do their houses. But in fact, they were connected. He did work on most of their houses before the bank explosion, and then just became the preeminent establishment architect. He clearly worked really hard, ran a significant firm, and was awarded in 1915 by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the first overseas British subject to receive their gold medal. The medal, Robert Hill sent me a photocopy of a letter that he wrote to the CCA in the 1980s, saying that there was a store in Vancouver that had the gold medal, and that the CCA should grab it, because they wanted $300 for it, and he couldn't afford it. So we thought that Madame Lambert would get it. So he just assumed that the CCA had it. So I reached out to the CCA recently, and they're like, we don't have it. We don't know where it is. So it's a mystery where this very important cultural artifact for Canada resides. So if anyone has a bead on it, let me know.
That's it. Alex has a question. She's got her hand up.
Hi, David.
Alex.
Thanks so much for the presentation.
Good to see you.
I was just curious, you mentioned the frame prefabs that were in the West, but did you notice any variation, like architecturally or stylistically, as you went across the country? Or was the objective actually to have like a consistency in design, because it was meant to be this sort of imperialistic framework across the entire Dominion, as opposed to doing sort of subtle changes that reflected local taste or aspirations?
Right. I don't know. I think so. For the masonry banks, there were subtle changes that just had to do with the site, right? So the Brandon, Manitoba and the London, Ontario were mirrors of each other. And ever so slight differences. But I think the bank was really invested in having a recognizable identity, the Bank of Commerce. So that's why they kept it at 3 types for the prefabs. And it's a really good question if, for instance, the hipped roof one was in snowier areas, for instance, or something like that. But it's unknown at this point.
So almost more branding. They wanted to have the same presence across the country.
100%, yeah.
Interesting.
Oh,
Thanks.
that's interesting. Thanks, Alex. James has a follow-up question.
It's more of a follow-up comment going back to the question. Looking at the prefab banks, there seem to be some variations, more like picking sort of accessory parts to the bank. Like some banks were furnished with lampposts out front, some may weren't. It seems, looking at the images, maybe the floor plates might have flipped. But in essence, as identified, there's 3 main types, and they had them ready to go. And depending on sort of the size or the community, they would send the cheapest version. That's sort of one interpretation. It was a more prestigious community that looks like it's going to be more established, and it was sent them with the more luxurious type of model. But the concept was try to project a consistent sort of corporate image, which still important today.
And James, would you say the more prestigious looking bank was the full classical portico one?
Yeah, I think so. Like, that's
Yeah.
my interpretation. The smaller one, was actually based on the prototype, and that's in Coburg, the prototype, if I recall correctly. And that's the model that you showed a photograph going to San Francisco.
Right.
I haven't crunched the numbers. I have an Excel table somewhere and we try to assign a good typology like you've done as well. And from there, we can crunch numbers to see how many of each model was actually made and in which townships they went to, and knowing which ones are still around or not. And some there's one I recently saw, like last year doing research, it was converted to a house. Insulated, renovated, but they try to keep the essence of the house, and no longer a bank, but it's still there.
Great. Well, we need to have a separate Zoom meeting to study this more.
You have to get John Ward on track, because maybe John and I perhaps are just going over some of these same stuff you guys have done, but we've also, I think, uncovered some new things as well.
Great.
That's
Wonderful.
fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. And I think, Steve, you've got a question. Get your hand up.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, David, for such a great presentation. My question, I'm glad to hear about Frank Darling, but can you comment on the partnership? Would you say it was an equal partnership between Darling and Pearson?
I think it was a balanced partnership. Everything I've read and have come to understand is that Darling was the creative force, the main creative force of Darling and Pearson, and that John Pearson was more of a technocrat. But there's nuance to it, right? Because John Pearson also had his own projects. He was responsible for the redesign of Center Block. And unfortunately, there's some hints in some of the periodicals that say this is a John Pearson project or Mr. Darling, So we're kind of going through the historiography and the contemporary accounts to understand how it was subdivided. And then the other thing, you know, having worked in a very large firm in New York for a while, no one person is responsible for a design. So it takes a team. So the firm also had, like I said before, scores of really talented draftsmen and architects working for them, who probably were the first to kind of generate the designs and have the senior partners review them. So it's a little bit blurry to kind of figure out attribution. But generally speaking, you know, it was Frank Darling who got the RIBA medal, and who started the firm. His name is first. So I still lean toward him being the main creative force. He was also, you know, what undergirds that is he was a member in the Royal Canadian Academy, the Ontario Society of Artists. He had a lot of artist friends. He donated some of his purchased French etchings to the AGO, which I've seen, which are quite lovely. So, you know, we're building up this narrative of Frank Darling as being a very kind of creative individual. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's all we know right now.
That's great. I just wondered if it was one of these sort of Adler and Sullivan partners where one's an architect, one's an engineer. But yeah, that's great. Thanks so much again, David.
My pleasure.
I'm watching the time here. We only have a few minutes left, so I think maybe we'll start to wrap up. First of all, I'd like to thank David for doing this. I think you should probably end with just mentioning the concept of the book project. I think that's also important to just mention, rather than just speaking about the content, but the actual scope of the ambitious project.
Right. Well, so we're currently talking to McGill Queen's Press, who are very excited about the project, and we've developed a structure for the book. I would say it's about 2/3 written. We're still doing some more research. We have an abundance of archival material, so the real challenge is going to be to select what goes in the book. But the book will be prefaced by Michael McClelland and another guest author. And then the first portion is about context. So it's Frank Darling's life. It's about and his partnerships. The second part of the first part is about Toronto, early 20th century Edwardian Toronto, and how it fits into a system of other cities in the Great Lakes, and how it compared to other imperial cities. And the third is the patronage context. So the plutocrats of Toronto, for whom Darling worked almost exclusively. So that sets us up then for the second part, which is really a conventional review of the building types. So we start with residential, we do the institutional. They did an incredible amount of work for the University of Toronto and other universities, but also the Art Gallery of Toronto and the hospital. Then on to what's next? Then the banks, of course, and then commercial buildings, clubs, and then tall buildings is kind of the climax. They became leaders in tall building design and early skyscrapers in Canada. And then what's really interesting and a very satisfying coda is that at the end of his career, he went back to his original client, the Trinity College, and designed a quasi replica of the original Trinity College in Trinity Bellwoods Park for the University of Toronto campus.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for the summary. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
I want to finish up by saying, well, first of all, thank you again. I think there was some comments that I didn't catch, but there are some really engaged comments in the chat. With that, I just want to finish up by thanking everyone for coming to one of the CapWork rooms. Our next one is, if we can see that, our next one is going to be in a few weeks, and it's with two guests. One is a CAP member, one of our member, and I'm glad to see a lot of CAP members here. And if you are not a CAP member, please join. But Ryan Lee, who's based out of Burlington, he and Dr. Celine Castes-Renard, who's she's a specialist in artificial intelligence through the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. And she's been generous enough to come and really give us a sense of where we're heading with this question of AI. I know that some firms have been playing around with it. Some people, maybe Hush Hush has been testing some of it out. I'm not naming names, but it's definitely out there. There's curiosity behind it. We're not sure how it will work in our professional sphere. There may be applications for it. There may be some really challenging questions behind it. So she's going to come and speak a little bit about the scope of what's happening, and it's happening quickly. We know that ChatGPT-4 has just come out last year, and it's going to build on that. So this is something we thought might be of interest to CAP members, and just how does it fit into your professional life. With that, again, thank you, David. If anyone has any questions or comments that they want to pass on, you can always send them to our admin address. With that, I'd like to wrap up. I think we've saved you 2 minutes of your time here, so you can always get those back. So thanks, everyone. Thank you again, David, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, bye.